the silent invasion. No one could say why they came, and by the time they appeared, any reasons seemed irrelevant. What mattered was that they were here, looming above us in a way that felt more like judgment than contact. The world froze in shock, and that was all it took. From the moment they arrived, one thing was clear. These beings, whoever they were far beyond us in every aspect: technology, understanding, even presence. They didn't issue commands, nor did they make any overt gestures of hostility. They simply came, revealing themselves without a word or action, and left humanity to draw its own conclusions. It was as if we were insects beneath a microscope, and for the first time, we were aware of it. I was driving my air taxi across the city, Sydney, bright and bustling as always, when the skies darkened. It wasn't the usual storm that sometimes rolled in from the ocean. This was different. It began with the air traffic control system lighting up with alerts, followed by a wave of confusion and panic. Within moments, the skies were clear of civilian craft as police cruisers darted through the air, ushering us all down to the nearest rooftops or landing pads. I set my cab down on a rooftop skypad near the Opera House, one of the higher platforms in the city with a direct view of the harbour. From there, I could see the entire expanse of the city, but more importantly, I had a front-row seat to the arrival of the massive alien vessel. My passenger, a young woman in a business suit on her way to a conference, had fallen silent, her face pale as she stared out the window. The ship, it was no mere object, stretched across the horizon, swallowing the sky. Its surface shimmered with strange patterns, like ripples of liquid metal, moving in ways that defied understanding. Black as night, it seemed to absorb the light around it, casting the city into an eerie twilight. Lightning crackled around the edges, as though the atmosphere itself struggled to contain its presence. Clara, my passenger, who I learned her name later, was gripping her phone, live-streaming the event as so many others around the city were doing. From my vantage point, I could see people emerging from their vehicles, craning their necks to take in the sight. Some were terrified, others simply mesmerized. But all of us were waiting for something to happen. "Do you think they'll talk to us?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't think they need to talk," I replied, my eyes locked on the ship. "They're making a statement just by being here." And that was the terrifying part. They didn't need to fire weapons or issue threats. The sheer size of the vessel, its presence alone, was enough to paralyze an entire city. For the first hour, all we could do was wait, expecting the worst. People began to pray, some openly sobbing, others standing in silent disbelief. But the ship did nothing. It hovered, silent and unmoving, as if observing us. There were no beams of light, no blaring announcements from the heavens. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder from the lightning that trailed in the ship's wake. It was as though it was waiting for us to make the first move. After an hour, the initial panic began to fade. People started to leave their vehicles, cautiously gathering in groups on the rooftops. Some even laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. A few bold individuals took out blankets and sat down, watching the ship as if it were some sort of cosmic spectacle. I couldn't believe it. Just a short while ago, we had all been convinced that the world was about to end. Now, people were treating it like a bizarre event, a curiosity to be documented and shared on social media. From where I stood, I could see phones flashing in unison, taking selfies with the alien ship, looming ominously in the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a casual visit. There had to be a purpose behind their arrival. The fact that they had done nothing was unsettling. Clara, too, seemed to sense this. She looked at me, her phone still raised, but there was worry in her eyes. What if this is just the beginning?" she asked quietly. What if they're waiting for us to mess up? I didn't have an answer, but her words stuck with me. What if this was a test? A psychological experiment on a planetary scale? The ship had given us no direct threats, but its presence had thrown the entire world into chaos. News reports began pouring in, riots in some cities, religious ceremonies in others. Some people believed this was the rapture, while others demanded military action. Every possible reaction to the unknown was on full display. And still, the ship did nothing. 2 hours passed. 3. The sun had disappeared entirely behind the massive vessel, leaving the city in a perpetual twilight. I saw families gathering on rooftops, holding each other close. The streets below were eerily silent. For the first time in my life, I felt like the world had paused, caught between one breath and the next, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship stirred. It was subtle at first, a slow rotation, barely perceptible, as if the ship was adjusting its position. Then, without warning, it began to ascend. It moved with a grace that belied its size, rising higher and higher into the clouds. Lightning flickered around it as it ascended, until eventually it vanished, leaving nothing but a distant storm in its wake. And just like that, it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. We were all too stunned, too uncertain of what had just happened. Then, slowly, people began to stir. Some shouted in relief, others in frustration, but no one had answers. Clara looked at me, her face a mix of disbelief and awe. "What now?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I don't think this is over." And I was right. This was just the beginning. The aliens had shown themselves, and in doing so, they had shaken the foundation of human society. But they hadn't engaged. They hadn't attacked. They had simply watched. And now, the world was left to wonder what their next move would be, and when they would return. Because they would return. That much was certain. We had been given a glimpse of something far beyond our comprehension, and now the waiting game had begun. Next time, we might not be so lucky.